In this video, we're going to continue examining a new document that has been released on Lucy Letby's grievance procedure in recent days. This is a continuation of the first part of this examination that's contained in the video Lucy Letby New Unseen Grievance Document Unveiled. You can see all of my previous videos on the grievance procedure here. I will no doubt make more in the future as there are many documents still to examine. So I think a question to ask again before I begin that I didn't actually pose in the previous part of this examination is, why has this taken so long to come out? This has been available for 10 years. This was authored in the latter months of 2016. It's now 2026. The Thirlwall Inquiry began years ago. Why is this only being released now? I suppose that if Thirlwall were to answer that, although they never answer any direct questions, I've seen several doctors, several credible people write them letters. I've seen those letters and I've seen the responses from Thirlwall. So I know that the inquiry is not overly keen on giving a direct answer to a direct question. But in the unlikely event that Thirlwall did give a direct answer to that question, they'd probably cite some sort of legal issues or something of that nature, or some sort of sensitive information. But nothing in this document is sensitive and nothing has been redacted as far as I can see. So I can see no excuse, and it would be an excuse, for why this hasn't been released before now. With that being said, let's get into the second part of this document. So we're going to take it up here. This is page 9 of 17, and we're going through Lucy's points that she's raised in her grievance. So this next point is, was I being investigated on a personal level, and is it that the external review may indicate in relation to me returning to the neonatal unit, and why the external review panel did not know about my circumstances, and why so much emphasis has been put on waiting for the review when it is not looking at anything pertinent to my situation. So with regard to this, Alison Kelly claims that she had been completely open with the review panel regarding Lucy's perceived commonality with the deaths on the unit. I think that's fair. This has been discussed, and there are many documents in Thirlwall that discuss various aspects of this commonality, and the nursing team do acknowledge that there is a commonality, but they would say, look, there's a reason for this. We have no reason to suspect anything. We think highly of Lucy, but they acknowledge there's a commonality, and that there is a degree of commonality. Of course, we know the statistical basis for this commonality is zero. That there's what they ultimately used, as I mentioned in the previous part, this was passed from the consultants through the hospital to the police, through the expert witnesses to the police, and then into the court case, and then she's convicted. And it's all on this germ of an idea from Brewery and J-Ram, and that was always dismissed by the nursing team. So I want to be clear on that. So Alison Kelly further stated that the executive team wished to give Lucy Letby the benefit of meeting with the review panel. Alison Kelly further advised that although the terms of reference to the review did not identify that they would look at the specifics of Lucy's situation, that if the panel felt there was a necessity to call the police or that the unit was unsafe, that the trust would have been made aware of this verbally and immediately. So in response to this, Dr. Chris Green writes, I conclude that the overarching purpose of the external review and the additional commission deep dive forensics review is to explore circumstances and detail around patient safety on the neonatal unit. With respect to the commonality identified between Lucy Letby being on duty and the collapses/deaths of the babies on the neonatal unit, I conclude that the executive team feel that the review will provide confirmation and reassurance that there is no direct link between the two. This would provide support for Lucy Letby in relation to assuring both herself and the trust of her clinical competence, and it is anticipated assuage the concerns raised by the consultants to the executive team. So of course we know it failed to assuage the concerns. They just said, well, it's not a medical review, which is true. As I've said several times, what should have happened at this point, after the RCPCH review, which of course, as we know, made multiple criticisms of the neonatal unit, if the consultants really wanted to insist on something, then they should have insisted on a medical review that would have been conducted by an external body. There was no justification for referral to the police. We know what a pig's ear the police made of the investigation. We know they were completely out of their depth. We know that they just got Evans and Evan just did the whole thing, basically. That was a complete calamity. The other thing as well is, of course, the executives or rather the consultants I should say, should have been reflecting on their own practice. After they received that RCPCH review that was very critical, rightly critical given what we know now, they should have been looking in the mirror. They claim that they did that, but it's very hard to believe that they did that with significant or satisfactory thoroughness based on what we know now. So then we move on to a critical point. I would like to know exactly what I've been accused of, / what allegations have been made, and by who, and how the Trust has dealt with this. The drive to remove Lucy Letby from the neonatal unit appears to have come from the consultant Stephen Brewery and to a lesser extent Ravi Jairam, so that is absolutely my opinion as well. The concept of air embolism also appears to have originated from the consultant body, although this is denied, so we now know that's true. It is the view of nursing and executive interviewees that the drive to blame Lucy Letby for the rise in mortality came from Stephen Brewery and Ravi Jairam, and this is supported by the email sent to Ravi Jairam to colleagues, in which he acknowledges they raised concerns over foul play and refers to air embolus being a potential cause of death. So again, we now know this to be true, except in much greater detail than Dr. Chris Green knew at the time. The same email also states that the board are fully aware that this may end up with the police being involved. While it is important that the Trust has a culture that allows members of staff to raise concerns about colleagues, I find it a concern that these concerns are based on gut feel and do not accept that this provides a basis on which to make the accusations that appear to have been made. So as I mentioned in the first part of this examination, they never provided any evidence whatsoever. There was no evidence. It is probably why they didn't provide any. But even after this case had been referred to the police, still, Brewery, Jairam, and indeed all of the other consultants collectively have provided no evidence. They just said there's a commonality and we have a gut feeling that there's something wrong. The whole thing is calamitous. It is quite upsetting for me at times like this when I just think how many opportunities they had. This could have been stopped so many times in so many different ways, and all it takes is someone competent with integrity to be involved at some stage, and it could have been stopped. There were so many opportunities to stop it, and then it just continued and continued and continued. I am therefore concerned as to whether this warrants further investigation under the Trust bullying and harassment policy. So this is actually mentioned in the conclusion of Dr. Chris Green that we'll get to before the end of this video. It is beyond the scope of this investigation to assess the detailed clinical evidence that might support any allegations against Lucy Letby. In fact, other than those that appear to have been made by Stephen Brewery and perhaps others, there are no allegations against Lucy Letby that could be clearly identified as originating from the Trust executive or management team. And so, again, just to emphasise once more, the reason that there were no allegations because they had no evidence to back up any such allegations. Further to that, no evidence was seen that supports the allegations against Lucy Letby other than the widely accepted view that Lucy Letby was on duty more often than any other staff member when neonatal deaths occurred on the unit, and even that association is tenuous for a number of reasons. So that is absolutely true. All they talked about in these documents as commonality. It's absolutely correct to say the association is tenuous. It's perhaps generous to describe it as tenuous, unfounded, maybe a better way of describing it, but the comments of Chris Green here are essentially absolutely correct. And in the previous video, I showed what happened when the police finally called him in 2.5 years into the investigation, and he was obviously under the impression during that conversation that the police would have investigated the case competently. I personally, even before I began to investigate this whole debacle, would not have made that assumption. Other people understandably do make that assumption, but that was an assumption that, of course, was completely incorrect. The fact that he's appearing there for the first time 2.5 years into the investigation, and that they've never bothered to even look at the grievance procedure, quite obviously, because they don't even know the name of Lucy's union representative, is indicative of the fact that they never looked at any other options. We basically know that now. We suspected it for a long time, but that document, well into 2019, the first time they're hearing about the name Tony Millea, the first time they bother to call Chris Green and all they basically say is, have you got any dirt on Lucy, please? We know they didn't look at anything else. We know they didn't investigate the consultants. We know they didn't look at the context of the hospital. They have just revealed that by releasing that document. The Trust has commissioned significant reviews of the cases, and at this time, there does not appear to be any information that suggests Lucy Letby is in any way responsible for what has happened on the unit. I therefore conclude that there does appear to be agreement around an association between Lucy Letby working on the unit and the neonatal deaths concerned, but this association is far from sufficient to allow any formal allegations to be made. Other than that, and gut feeling from Stephen Breary, there is no obvious evidence at this time to raise any suspicions about Lucy Letby. Again, this is undeniably true. It's right that Stephen Breary is named here because it all comes off the back of his gut feeling that begins in June 2015 and is cemented in July 2015. This is a year on from that gut feeling originating, and there is still no evidence at this point in time. So, as Dr. Chris Green rightly states, there is no information suggesting Lucy's any way responsible, and that would only arrive when Dr. Evans got to work. Prior to that, there was nothing at all. The nursing team from the neonatal unit, Ariane Powell and Yvonne Griffiths, reported that there had been allegations made against Lucy Letby by the consultants around Lucy's involvement in the neonatal deaths. Yvonne Griffiths reported that Stephen Breary had made his allegations based on gut feeling. Ariane Powell reported that John Gibbs had been the voice of reason, advising colleagues to be very careful about what they're doing, and that he had said that a nurse in Stepping Hill was wrongly accused, and we could end up doing the same thing. So I think this is a very important point, because I know some people have said to me, and I personally didn't agree with this, that Dr. Gibbs had been kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes. Of course, that's still possible, regardless of this comment. But I do think that he at least did voice some concerns. I know his performance in the Netflix documentary was not to be commended, but I do think he actually, if you look at the documents, he did raise a few points to say, look, what are we doing here? This could be completely wrong. But Stephen Breary was absolutely determined that this case would be referred to the police. I don't think I will ever understand why he did that, and I think there's a distinct possibility he will never understand why he did that. And lots of people have suspicions, lots of people have various views. We can't prove any of those views. It would be impossible. Probably even if we had access to everyone that worked on the neonatal unit, you'd probably get 5 different stories. That may give us some insight, but obviously we don't have that access anyway. I don't think we're ever going to know why this happened, but there was concern from Saladin, there was concern from Gibbs, and they just ploughed on anyway. In terms of Lucy Letby and individual neonatal deaths, Yvonne Griffiths stated that each time there was a death, there was a review into each one, and at no time were there specific concerns about Lucy Letby. Of course, this is not surprising, because, as I pointed out, when it went to the police, it went to the police with zero evidence, as the police themselves acknowledged. Yvonne Griffiths also reported that there had been a suggestion that air embolism had been used to harm the neonates. So this is... Let's just say that this is a very unlikely diagnosis that is brought up by Dr. Jairam, and he finds this obscure 1989 paper, and then Dr. Evans also cites the same diagnosis when admitting that he knows nothing about it and he's never had anything to do with it previously, and he also cites the same paper. It's an incredible coincidence, I'm sure you'll agree. Karen Rees reported that there had been a suggestion of foul play by Ravi Jairam in that it had been suggested that air embolism or twisting of tubes might have been the cause of death. This is corroborated by the email sent to Ravi Jairam to colleagues, in which he makes specific reference to giving the concerns we raised around foul play, with air embolus being considered among the pathology, and this may end up with the police involved. Ravi Jairam also emailed colleagues on the 30th of June to signpost an article around neonatal air embolism. So I want to say as well that this is another example of something being passed from the consultants through the hospital to the police to Evans to the court case, and now Lucy's in prison. So it's just another thing being passed along the line. Like all of these things that occur, there are so many things that just get passed along from one body to another without ever being questioned, let alone challenged, and then they're in court, and then they're in front of a jury that doesn't understand them, and then Lucy's in prison. It is an almost incomprehensible level of incompetence that's been involved in this. And I think that's why many people believe that there's more than incompetence, and I understand that. But I think it really is, for the most part, or overwhelmingly, just absolute abject stupidity and incompetence. Obviously, there may be some other things thrown in there as well. Sue Hodkinson, in an email to Hayley Cooper dated the 22nd of September, to reiterate that your member, Lucy Letby, is not under any formal investigation or disciplinary sanction by the Trust. Of course, that would have been impossible because there was no evidence presented. So then we move on to the next point. How will the Trust support me to return to the neonatal unit on a personal and professional level? Lucy Letby is described as an excellent nurse by her nursing colleagues and managers. She's described as helpful and accommodating, often switching shifts or duties to support the unit. So let's just note before we go any further, this was used against her in court. The fact that she was willing to switch shifts, I should say, and take on extra duties, do overtime, do everything they can did everything she could to ensure that this struggling unit could run as competently as possible. That was used against her. Oh, it's suspicious. It's suspicious that after deaths she was willing to go back to work and all this stuff. External consultants visiting the unit for transfers are reported to have commented positively on her professionalism and quality of care. Lucy Letby is also described as being well trained and competent. Of course, she was one of the few nurses on this unit who had worked on a level 3 unit in Liverpool, and that's why she was often elevated beyond her level of experience, I would say. Her nurse management colleagues, Ariane Powell and Yvonne Griffiths, have no concerns about her clinical or professional activities and would welcome her back to the unit. So they said specifically, I think it was Ariane Powell who said, I want her back, I definitely want her back, for example. In terms of returning Lucy Letby to her post on the neonatal unit, the nursing management team and trust executives all gave positive affirmation that pending the results of the external reviews, that their expectation was that Lucy Letby would be returning to the unit. This was less clear-cut with the consultants Rafi Jairam and Stephen Brewery, who stated that, would I have issue if Lucy was returned to the unit? Yes. I don't think our concerns raised with the executives have been fully answered. So, I mean, this is absolutely clear that Stephen Brewery and Rafi Jairam were driving this from day one. I mean, we've established this on the channel through documents multiple times. There's no doubt that this is the case, but they absolutely were not willing to have anything else other than Lucy being referred to the police. There was no other outcome that they were willing to accept. I think if there had been an external medical review, they still wouldn't have been able to accept that. And what needed to happen, as I've mentioned previously, is that the executive team, they were trying to hold everything together, they were treading on eggshells, they were dealing with a very, very delicate situation, and I understand that, but they needed a kind of Trumpian approach of saying, look, put up or shut up. That is basically what you need to do at this point. Either get on the unit, do your job, and shut the you-know-what up, or go to the police yourself, or leave. Those are your options. I've got a document here that says we should launch disciplinary proceedings against you. I'm perfectly willing to do that if you don't shut up. If you continue along this route, I will launch disciplinary proceedings against you. So it's up to you what happens from this point. Shut up about, I need to go to the police. You haven't provided any evidence. That's the bare minimum requirement. So if you can't do that, you need to go to the police yourself. If you're not willing to do that, shut up. If you're not willing to do that, get out of the hospital. That's what needed to happen. But understandably, the executive didn't do that because they were trying to handle it delicately. They were perhaps trying to protect their own backs to a certain extent. They were trying to hold everything together. They were trying to make sure the hospital and neonatal unit didn't collapse. But unfortunately, they needed to take a nuclear option in this situation. And it's worked out far, far worse for the hospital now. Because although at this point in time, officially, Lucy Letby is still responsible for everything that occurred on the unit, firstly, public opinion is turning against that very strongly, and that will only continue in the months to come. And then secondly, this will cast a shadow over the County Chester Hospital for a very, very long time, and it's doubtful in our lifetime whether it will ever be able to resurrect its reputation, unfortunately, because this is just such a big issue, obviously, and things have occurred that were so wrong. And they tried to kind of take a softly kid gloves approach when that just wasn't going to work with these people. It's absolutely clear from this statement that they're just not going to allow Lucy to return to the unit, and they're not going to be happy until it goes to the police. Now, the executives didn't think it was justified, obviously rightly so, because they had no evidence to send it to the police with. So at that point, they should have said, look, we don't think it's justified to send this to the police, and if you can't accept the current situation, you need to put your neck on the line. So Stephen Bury and Ravi Jayram were very clever and very shrewd in what they did, and that they got the case referred to the police, and they never had to take any risks at all. And then it says, Yvonne Griffiths also reported in her interview that she was concerned about Lucy's return to the unit and what Stephen Bury might say to her. So this is, again, indicative of the fact of something that I've said many times, that there's no way Lucy can go back onto this unit. I fully understand why she wanted to do it, and I know it's easy for me to say that, but there is no prospect that she can safely go back to work on this unit, particularly with Bury and Jayram there. It would be difficult even if they'd left, but with them still working there and her having to work directly alongside them and even, I suppose, underneath them to a certain extent, there's just no prospect that's ever going to be safe for her. And Yvonne Griffiths, I think it's something of an understatement to say that she's concerned about Lucy's return. She should be more than concerned, I would suggest. All three executive directors interviewed reported that the decision to redeploy Lucy Letby was taken by the board, and that a decision to return Lucy Letby to the unit would also need to be taken by the board, which is obviously that would just be a natural process. This also is indicative, as I say, of the fact that they could have nipped this in the bud. They have the ultimate authority over the neonatal unit, and they can tell the consultants, this is how things are going to operate, and if you don't like it, you can leave. But they just didn't have the courage to do that. I find that Lucy Letby's ongoing redeployment is a difficult decision for the executive team, and one that they have taken to ensure that there are no doubts as to the potential causes of the increase in mortality prior to Lucy Letby's return to the unit. The decision to redeploy Lucy Letby was taken by the Trust Board, and a decision to return Lucy Letby to the unit will therefore also need to be a Trust Board decision. However, in interviews with nursing management and the executive team, the universal view is that Lucy Letby will be supported to return to her role pending the receipt of the final reports and agreement from the Trust Board. So, reflecting on this, I suppose the important thing to emphasise is there is no suggestion that Lucy wasn't going to return to the unit. Without Stephen Bury and Ravi Jayram, that would have happened, because there was no reason for it not to happen, because there was no evidence she'd done anything wrong, and therefore she never should have been removed from the unit in the first place. Assuming these conditions are met, I am certain that there is a genuine desire to see Lucy Letby back on the unit. From the interviews I conducted with Stephen Bury and Ravi Jayram, their views and intended course of action on the return of Lucy Letby to the neonatal unit were not entirely clear, and will need to be clarified prior to Lucy Letby's return to the unit, assuming that is the intended course of action. So essentially what occurred at this point is that Stephen Bury and Ravi Jayram rallied the rest of the consultants in particular, but also they themselves expressed the view that we're not happy with Lucy coming back, we're not going to accept Lucy coming back, the only acceptable course of action for us is for the case to be referred to the police. And so the return of Lucy was delayed and delayed and delayed, and then eventually the case was referred to the police. When what should have happened is, as I say, they needed to be met head on, and that they needed to be dealt with directly, which never happened. I have found that the Trust executive team and nurse management team have showed significant empathy for Lucy's situation, and that they have all been deeply affected by it. I also believe that the executive team have reflected on their initial handling of the situation and taken action to address this in their fortnightly meetings with Lucy Letby. So Lucy did receive some support this time. I believe it was not satisfactory under the circumstances, but there was a broad acknowledgement that both from the executives and even more so from the nursing team that she'd been treated in a way that was very unfair. Of course, things are going to get much, much, much worse for her. But already at this point, she'd suffered discrimination, and as I've said again numerous times, she would have won a wrongful dismissal claim very easily. I think there's absolutely no doubt that she would have had a claim for wrongful dismissal. Particularly, she could walk in there armed with this document, and armed with the outcome, and armed with the fact that there's all these documents and statements saying that she was accused of killing babies with no evidence. She'd get a payoff, she'd get a significant payoff. I have been informed that she'd never be able to work in nursing again, realistically, and that would be terrible for her, but at least she'd have had some leeway. She'd have had a few years, several years to think about what am I going to do with the rest of my life. I'm devastated that my dream career has been taken away from me, but I have the opportunity to rebuild my life. I couldn't go back onto that unit with Breary and Jairam, particularly Breary and Jairam, but where others as well have made accusations that I've attempted to kill infants. There is just no way that I can do that. It's a great shame. It's very unfair. But now I just need to work out what to do to rebuild my life. And obviously, it's easy to say this with the benefit of hindsight, but that's what would have needed to happen. And I think really, probably her union rep should have been telling her this. I understand why union reps were trying to help negotiate her return back to the unit, but probably someone just needed to say, look, Lucy, you cannot go back into a workplace where people have accused you of killing infants, because there are multiple reasons, but here's a very simple one straight away. If anything goes wrong, you're going to be suspect number one immediately, and you're going to be putting yourself in a very hazardous situation. Now, it's possible no one could imagine that happening and no one could imagine it going to the police, but based on what we've seen in this grievance procedure, that didn't require an enormous amount of imagination. The decision to redeploy Lucy was taken following concerns raised by an association between cases in which the rise in neonatal mortality had been related to and the presence of Lucy Letby on the neonatal unit at the time of their deterioration and their death. Once again, let me emphasise this once again, it's passed from the consultant's brain through the hospital, through the grievance procedure, to the police, to Evans, to the Crown Prosecution Service, to court, to the barristers, to prison. Again. Ravi Jairam reports in his interview that the deaths were a particular concern because they occurred in babies in which the deterioration had not been predicted and was not easily explained. So I think it's fair to say that some of the deteriorations are not easily explained, and do require experts of a very high level of ability and experience, which was not true of Dr. Jairam, and I would suggest not true of Dr. Breary. That's why they couldn't understand what was happening on the unit, and that's why you hear in the court case, a lot of the court case, as I've said, is just simply people from the hospital saying, we had no idea what was going on. We know that you had no idea what was going on, and we know why. It's due to the lack of competence of the unit, which is why it was downgraded, why it's never been upgraded, why it probably never will be upgraded ever again. So, actually, it's true that some of these deteriorations are not easily explained. However, some of the deteriorations are easily explained, and they frankly should have known why the infants had deteriorated. And there were not only mistakes in the way that these infants were treated, but there were basic mistakes made in diagnosis. So that is the most fundamental aspect of medicine, because if you don't know what you're treating, then how can you possibly treat it correctly? So just to give two examples, Child D was calamitously mismanaged, and there was definitely some poor diagnosis involved as well. And in the case of Child O, they failed to diagnose subcapsular hematoma. That also occurred in the case of Child P. Now, I've asked some qualified people, is this something that is difficult to diagnose? And I was told that in a level 3 unit, it would be, given the clinical signs of the infant, it'd be something that a neonatologist would think about immediately. So these are the kind of very fundamental mistakes that they made with regard to diagnosis. And the reason for that is that they were underqualified. So we'll continue from the bottom paragraph. Karen Rees was made aware that Stephen Breary had concerns about a nurse on the unit and went to meet him in his office to see what these concerns were. Karen Rees also reported in her interview that Ravi Jairam had raised a major concern with Lucy Letby that she might be purposefully harming babies. Following that discussion, Karen Rees went to see Alison Kelly to discuss the matter further, and it was agreed that there was no basis to take any action against Lucy Letby. That is, there were no grounds to exclude Lucy Letby, and that the ward manager, Ariane Powell, had no concerns regarding the competence or behaviours of Lucy Letby. What I would say with regard to this is, as was discussed in the previous part, there is no doubt that Lucy should have been informed of this. That's just a major failing. That evening, Karen Rees was contacted by Stephen Breary at home to discuss the matter. Stephen Breary reports in his interview that he discussed the matter with Karen Rees regarding Lucy Letby, and that Karen Rees had decided that no action was required. Karen Rees reports in her interview that she felt Stephen Breary attempted to bully her, put pressure on her to remove Lucy Letby from the unit. So there's some interesting insight there into the kind of lengths that Stephen Breary has gone to have Lucy removed, that he's contacting Karen Rees in her spare time, and that Of course, this is a matter of opinion, and Stephen Breary has a right of reply, but Karen says that she felt Steve Breary was trying to bully her, put pressure on her to remove Lucy from the unit. Of course, Karen has to say, it's the only thing she could possibly say, Stephen, we don't have any evidence. There's no evidence, there's no reason to remove her because you haven't provided any evidence. At the neonatal team's weekly meeting, there was a discussion amongst the team regarding the deaths and the potential course of action open to the team. At this meeting, there appears to have been discussions about the potential role of Lucy Letby in the deaths of these babies. Yvonne Griffiths reports that Stephen Breary had threatened to go to the police about the matter. So, they're having meetings, they're discussing this. Breary and J-Ram have an explicit position, even though they very obviously didn't tell the truth during this grievance procedure, because when they were asked about it, when J-Ram was asked about it, he said, there's no evidence at all. There's no reason whatsoever to suspect Lucy Letby had done anything wrong. But really, privately, and not even privately, on the unit, they were not saying that at all. They were saying the complete opposite. And this final statement, as I say, Stephen Breary is threatening to go to the police. So they really should have called his bluff and said, okay, Stephen, you go to the police, as I've said. And unfortunately, this was mismanaged, and the calamitous debacle that has occurred has been the result of that. So this continues. As a result of this, concerns were raised with the Trust executive team. In her supporting statement, Ariane Powell reports that Steve Breary had intimated during a meeting on the 16th of May 2016 that he thought a member of staff was causing the increase in mortality, and in the same meeting that another consultant had accused her of harbouring a murderer. Ariane Powell reports that she raised a concern that there was no evidence to support this, and that she was quietened by Stephen Breary in an angry manner when she objected. So you can see what the atmosphere was like on the unit at this time, and it would have been impossible, in my view, for Lucy to return to the unit in any kind of safe capacity. This is indicative of you've heard many people on this channel talk about the consultant body, talk about how powerful it is, not just in this hospital, but in many. And you're seeing a kind of example here of the kind of arrogance that is possible to exist in such people. Of course, there are many good consultants who are good people as well, but a kind of unchallengeable conceit can fester and grow in these people, and so they can feel confident to, Ariane Powell is saying, look, you can't say these type of things, and then instead of acknowledging, well, actually you're completely correct in everything you're saying, as it's described here, she was quietened by Stephen Breary in an angry manner, as if she was wrong to say, look, you can't go throwing around these kind of type of accusations with no evidence. So the more that I've come to learn about hospitals, the more I've thought, I'm glad that I don't work in one. Alison Kelly reported that the consultants were concerned about the situation. Alison Kelly also reported that there was talk about whistleblowing and going to the police. So I suppose the only reaction you need to make to that is that the idea that they weren't voicing their concerns, as is suggested by J-Ram essentially during the grievance procedure, is unfounded. So we'll move on now to the response to the grievance. You should have a good image now, a good impression of what has occurred, what was occurring on the unit, what the atmosphere was, what the situation was for Lucy. Alison Kelly and Sue Hodkinson both intimated during their interviews that there was a delay in acknowledging the grievance. The reason for this was because of the unusual circumstances around the case, and that they had decided to get an external reviewer to hear the grievance and had wanted to arrange this prior to responding. So this seems pretty reasonable to me. The Trust's usual first stage for dealing with a grievance will be to hold an informal meeting, but due to the nature of the case, it was agreed to move directly towards an investigation. Alison Kelly and Sue Hodkinson agreed that there was a delay, and this was acknowledged in writing to Lucy Letby in the letter dated 11th of October 2016, Appendix 16. So what I would say to that is that while this may have been unacceptable for Lucy at the time, I do think that this was all done for the right reason, and I think overall the way the grievance was handled was pretty professional, really, and they did think about carefully what they wanted to do, and it was conducted in a way that I think was pretty close to ideal, really. And the outcome, as you've heard people say, you heard Martin say in particular, Martin Pittman, is that it's extraordinary that a nurse has won against all the consultants, and that wouldn't usually happen. And I've certainly heard the opinion expressed that there was probably a lot of pressure put on the executives, put on the people running the grievance to favour the consultants. And the fact that didn't happen is pretty incredible in itself. And I think overall, when we look at not just the validity, but the thoroughness and the way that this grievance was structured and run, I think it was pretty commendable, really. So I think the delay is understandable under these circumstances where they're trying to make sure it's done well, and I think it absolutely was done well. I conclude that the response to the grievance submitted by Lucy Letby to the Trust executives was slower than might usually be expected with reference to the Trust policy. It is my opinion that the reasoning for this does give a reasonable explanation for the delay in responding to the grievance. However, I am also of the opinion that the Trust should have been more proactive in informing Lucy Letby of the reasoning behind this at the time. So that's fair. I agree with both points. Clearly there's been a bit of a lack of transparency and a lack of speed with regard to messaging. It's also fair to say that I think the delay is purely because they wanted to do the best job that they could and make it as thorough process as possible, because they understood, the nursing team and the executive team both understood, some extremely serious allegations have been made. There hadn't been any evidence put forward to support them. So therefore, this individual undoubtedly has a legitimate grievance, and it's important that this is handled in a very thorough and fair way, and that it just doesn't become a way to whitewash the situation and back up the consultant. So I personally think the delay was entirely justified under these circumstances. Of course, you'd like things to progress more quickly, but the most important thing always is that things are done well. Of course, the Thirlwall Inquiry has managed to do things slowly and badly. So now we're going to move on to questioning around a potential relationship between Lucy Letby and Stephen Bury. This is obviously a very important aspect to this document. When questioned about alleged inquiries into any relationship issues between Stephen Bury and Lucy Letby, Alison Kelly, Sue Hodkinson and Karen Rees agreed that it had been discussed privately, but purely in the context of trying to understand why Stephen Bury had singled out Lucy Letby for individual scrutiny. So this sounds like the kind of thing that could have been gossiped about on the unit, and then maybe they've heard some whispers and they've thought, is there something here? Has Lucy rebuffed some advances from Bury or something of that nature? It seems to me that there is no real substance to this, and they're just literally floating possible reasons for why Bury is behaving in a way that appears to be completely irrational. So it continues. There was no direction from the executive team to suggest or investigate the existence of any sort of relationship between Stephen Bury and Lucy Letby. In an email from Sue Hodkinson to Hayley Cooper, dated the 22nd of September, Sue Hodkinson responds to questioning by Hayley Cooper around this by stating that they are not aware of the issues raised by Hayley Cooper and that nothing had been commissioned by the executive team in relation to this matter. So I would conclude from this that it's something that continues to be mentioned occasionally. Is that there are still some whispers around it, but I think that this is just something that has no substance. I don't... Whether there was a poor relationship between Stephen Bury and Lucy Letby is another matter entirely. Now, I've seen no evidence of this. There is a comment, I think it's from Karen Rees, it's either from Karen or Ariane Powell, where they say Stephen Bury isn't usually malicious. So this would be kind of deemed to be out of character by even those who defended Lucy on the unit. So that kind of gives one indication that this isn't something that he would usually do. I don't think there's any evidence, and I don't think it's likely that there was a, more... I think we all suspect that this doctor, who's seemingly middle-aged, I've heard that he's not likely to win any beauty contests anytime soon. I don't know who he is or what he looks like, so I can't comment on that. But it seems, based on what I've heard, that it's not particularly likely that Lucy would be attracted to him, and she pretty much poo-poos this when asked about it. So she may not have been aware of his intentions and may not really have cared that much about his intentions, because she probably would want someone closer to her own age, in all probability, who isn't married to someone else, who doesn't look like the back end of a bus. So under those circumstances, I think it's very unlikely that Lucy had any romantic interest in this gentleman. However, I think most of us would conclude that he probably did see her as a bit more than a friend. It will be a very natural thing. You know, I'm a man. I know what men are like. It's not difficult to deduce what was happening here. But I think while it's conceivable that could occur with Brewery, it doesn't, to me, seem that there's any evidence to support this whatsoever, based on what I've seen. Whether or not he could have been viewing Lucy unfavourably because of things that she's done on the unit, particularly, I know was a very conscientious compiler of Datex information. I don't know. It's impossible for me to say. I think that it's a possibility, but we're never going to know. We're just never going to be able to find out. I think even if we did, as I say, interview people from the hospital, we still wouldn't know for certain. Even Stephen Brewery may not know for certain. It may be subconscious. It may not be a conscious bias. Who knows? But the idea that they had some sort of romantic relationship or Lucy had rebuffed his advances or something like that, I really don't think there's any evidence to support that. So I'll move on to the final two sections now, beginning with conclusions, and is subtitled Competency, Supervision and Subsequent Redeployment. What I would say about this section is that there are multiple important points made, so we'll reflect on some of those points as we go through. In my investigation of this grievance, it is clear that the Trust management team, particularly the Trust executive team, found themselves in a very difficult situation. I don't think anyone could reasonably disagree with that. There needed to be a careful assessment of patient safety, namely the neonates on the unit, the needs of Lucy Letby as a member of the neonatal unit staff, the concerns raised by the consultant staff regarding the association between Lucy Letby's presence on the unit and the neonatal deaths, and also the risk that the police may have been called if action had not been taken. So let's just unpack that for a second. The critical aspect of this that they needed to look at was the assessment of patient safety. When that occurred, the attitudes of the consultants didn't change at all. So as I've said, after that had occurred, and there had been certainly a very thorough, not just careful, assessment of patient safety, and an assessment of competence on the unit, and it was found that there were massive issues, fundamental issues, that was the point where they needed to be told, the consultants, look, put up or shut up, preferably shut up. But if you're going to put up, there either needs to be a medical inquiry or you need to go to the police. Obviously, it's far better for there to be a medical inquiry, but you need to put your necks on the line and accept that you can be criticised for your practice. And it does seem, we can infer, although we don't know for sure, that this can be a motivating factor with why they didn't want to do this. But the executive team were trying to handle what is acknowledged in the first sentence as being a very difficult situation. They're trying to handle it delicately, and unfortunately that has blown up in their face. Given the positive views of Lucy Letby's competence, capability and flexibility regarding when she is needed, Lucy Letby is likely to be in a position where she may be looking after the sickest babies on the unit, and coupled with the fact that she works full-time and will work extra shifts when asked, this increases the likelihood that she might be on duty when adverse events occur. So we know this to be the case. Of course, this is the massive problem with the commonality. We've known this for a long time. It's not that this wasn't known at the time, and yet it's still been passed along the line and been used erroneously. The shift chart is now a complete joke, and the commonality is also treated as what it is, which is absolute nonsense. Unfortunately, they had the warnings. It was all there, and because of the executives, particularly Brewery, and to a slightly lesser extent J-Ram, were so fixated, I would say borderline obsessed with this notion that it has to be Lucy, we need to get the police involved. They just completely ignored all reason, frankly. That said, having been informed of the consultant's allegations, the Trust executive team and board were forced to consider the possibility that there may be a suggestion of foul play and the implications of returning Lucy Letby to the unit if that were the case. So that's a very fair point, and this is why the executive team are in such a difficult position, because they can't just brush away the suggestions of Brewery, J-Ram and the other consultants in case they're correct. Because if they're shown to have said, yeah, but what you're saying is a load of rubbish, and then it turns out they're correct, that's going to be an absolute disaster for the hospital, it's going to be an absolute disaster for them, and so on and so forth. So they have to take it seriously, but then at the same time, when they're asking for the evidence that they would require in order to take some form of action, that evidence is not forthcoming, and indeed, hasn't even emerged by the time that they're finally kind of badgered into going to the police. So they are in an unbelievably difficult position. I feel so sorry for them that they've now been arrested under these corporate manslaughter charges. I don't know anything about the perverting the cause of justice. We'll see if we hear more about that. But they were put in such a difficult position. I think they've behaved quite professionally, and they've tried to treat everyone with regard and dignity. They've had to balance all these different things. They're treading on eggshells the whole time. It must have been an incredibly difficult atmosphere around the unit. And then let's not forget, they can't just say, look, we're not going to look after your babies because we're having a few problems. They've still got to run, a fully functioning neonatal unit in this climate. So they had an incredibly difficult job to do. And it's for this reason that I'm always resistant to being critical of them, because I really do think they did the best that they could. Albeit, as I've said, they needed to play hardball with the consultants after the RCPCH review and after this grievance procedure conclusion had been released. Therefore, the Trust Executive Team and Trust Board, in the absence of firm, objective evidence, or indeed any evidence at all, to identify the true situation on the unit, clearly found themselves in a situation where it is conceivable, if unthinkable, that to leave Lucy Letby on the neonatal unit may have exposed patients to harm. Secondly, Lucy Letby may have been left in a position where ultimately she may have been subject to adverse treatment from consultant staff, and ultimately she may have been arrested, which one would imagine to be infinitely more damaging than redeployment. In gaining advice from other trusts who have been involved in similar situations, the board were able to take a considered view on a course of action that was in effect the best fit for an impossible situation. Redeploying Lucy Letby to another team within the trust removed the risk of the situation escalating, particularly with regard to the police being called, and at the same time allowed the trust to commission full investigations as to what might have contributed to the increase in mortality rates. So there's a few things to unpack here. The first thing is, when this is described as an impossible situation, I think that's a very fair description. And I think the conclusion regarding the redeployment is absolutely fair. But ironically, no one could possibly have predicted this, but it would have been better for Lucy and better for the hospital if it had been referred to the police at that time. It would have been, and this is, they can't continue to skate around the fact that someone wants the police to be called. They need to be told, look, you need to call the police now. If you're that certain that this needs to be done, you need to do it now and you need to do it yourself. I'm not going to do it because there's no evidence for me to do that. And if that had been done at that time, there's a good chance this would have gone no further, because it's unlikely Evans would have become involved. We don't know for sure, but it's less likely Evans would have become involved. He happened to be available at the time. It's quite possible he wouldn't have been available in 2016. Would any other expert, using the term loosely, have gone into the police station and say, oh, it's definitely inflicted harm, leave it all to me? Quite possibly, yes. We can't rule that out completely, because they were going to employ Martin Ward-Platt, who'd already presided over 2 miscarriages of justice related to murder, been involved with 2 of them, certainly one of them he was centrally involved. So I don't think we can rule out the idea that another medic, another expert may have gone in and done something similar. We don't know. But there's obviously, the chances would be significantly reduced, I would say. So actually, instead of just saying, oh, we don't want to upset anyone and we don't want to upset anyone, it'd be terrible for Lucy. Of course, it would have been terrible for Lucy, but it would have been better if they'd called the police as soon as possible, if they were going to do that. Of course, what really should have happened is they should have gone to an external medical body and done a full investigation, because they keep talking about, we need to understand what's happened on the unit, but that never happened, because they never went to an external medical body, and then when it went to the police, Evans made no attempt to understand what occurred on the unit. We know that for a fact. There is a clear and consistent view from the executive team that the neonatal unit may have been a vulnerable environment for Lucy. I think that's an understatement. And that they did what they believed to be in her interests. However, Lucy Letby was not informed of the full story and given the opportunity to make that decision for herself, and was therefore left in a position where information came to her in an uncoordinated manner, leading to a breakdown in trust. So, as I've said, I can understand the reasons this occurred, but when such serious allegations are made, simply it is incumbent on the employer to inform the employee. It's as simple as that. I'm therefore confident the Trust Executive Team and the Trust Board made a decision that they believe was the best possible solution given their overall assessment of the situation. However, I am also confident that the executive team were not, and are not entirely comfortable with this decision from Lucy Letby's perspective, and it has been suggested that they may have made the wrong decision for the right reasons. I entirely agree with that. I am also confident that if the executive believed that there was any evidence that Lucy Letby was actually responsible for any deliberate acts that may have led to the deaths of any neonates, they would have taken a different course of action than redeployment. Again, I completely agree with that. That is, the Trust executive team would have begun an investigation into Lucy Letby and/or informed the police of their suspicions. Again, I think this is undeniable. It's reflective of the fact that there was no evidence. To repeat myself once again, there needed to be a medical investigation at this point. Unfortunately, a competent medical investigation only happened in 2024 when Lucy Letby was already in prison, and the panel looked at the cases, the neonatal notes, tried to get the obstetric information, did various other things, went through all the Thirlwall documents, understood the context of the hospital. That was the first time there was a competent medical investigation. Unfortunately, that was a bit too late for Lucy. Questioning around a potential relationship between Lucy Letby and Stephen Breary. In terms of questioning the relationship between Lucy Letby and Stephen Breary, I'm satisfied that this was purely on the basis of excluding the possibility of a personal issue between Lucy Letby and Stephen Breary as a root cause of Stephen Breary's behaviour towards Lucy Letby. I do not believe that there was any untoward motivation in questioning this as a potential factor in why Lucy Letby had been singled out by Stephen Breary. So, I mean, I agree with that, and I don't think there's any evidence for, Stephen Breary to have any interest in Lucy beyond a professional relationship. Whether that professional relationship was tainted by Lucy's Datex entries and other things, we don't know. It's a distinct possibility. So the final section here is recommendations. Returning Lucy Letby to the neonatal unit. My recommendation is that the grievance be upheld and that Lucy Letby be given the opportunity to return to the neonatal unit. Of course, this should have happened rapidly. It should have happened as quickly as possible. The longer it's delayed, the harder it is for Lucy. And there's reports of Lucy going to kind of open days and being annoyed and having an annoyed demeanour, which is entirely understandable because she's been completely vindicated by this. And Chris Green is saying here she should be returned to the neonatal unit because there's no evidence she's done anything wrong. And she's definitely been discriminated against. So if Lucy wanted to go back to the neonatal unit, even though I personally think that's a mistake, that should have happened. It should have been happening within weeks. Never mind it dragged on for months and months and months, and then eventually it never happened at all. That's just weak management, to be honest. In that context, I also believe that Lucy Letby's return to the unit should be managed in tandem with the final reports regarding the neonatal unit's mortality figures. It is my belief that given the allegations allegedly raised by the consultants against Lucy Letby, that the absence of any suspicion against her in the external reviews and reports would support Lucy Letby by removing any doubt as to the cause of these deaths. And so what the consultants have said is, these weren't medical investigations. So, as I'll say for about the 20th time, that would be the point where the executives need to say, look, put up or shut up, we'll have a medical investigation, it will need to investigate you as well. Or you can go to the police, or you can shut up, or you can leave. And they needed to say that explicitly, not try and manage all the relationships. I understand why they did that. It was very delicate, it was very difficult, it was, as it's rightly been described here, an impossible situation. But that's what they needed to do. I would also recommend that the neonatal unit consultant team are clear in their intention regards Lucy Letby's return to the unit. This needs to be explicitly clarified in readiness of Lucy Letby's return to the unit. So this should be happening. It should be happening quickly. Inevitably, after a period of 4 to 5 months away from the unit, Lucy Letby will require the opportunity to reacquire her competencies and will therefore require clinical support from her colleagues. So that's another reason why it needs to happen more quickly. If it drags on for more months, it gets more difficult to reintegrate her, she needs more support, there are more problems. So basically, they just needed to bite the bullet and make this happen quickly, and they failed to do that. And that can only be described as a failing. Trust management team. In terms of the trust management team, while the consequence of their decision to redeploy has been clearly extremely distressing for Lucy Letby and her family, I do believe that they have set out to make the correct decisions in very difficult circumstances. I conclude that TET and TB made an appropriate decision regarding the redeployment. I believe that these decisions were made by the TET and TB in a robust and considered manner, and that the decision regarding Lucy's redeployment was one that the TET, this must be the executive team, and the board, I would assume, have found the most difficult to reconcile. In retrospect, the executive team might have done more to communicate with Lucy Letby and might have been more open and honest about why Lucy Letby had redeployed. However, it is clear that their intentions around this were positively directed. I therefore do not have any recommendations for the trust management team other than to use the opportunity to reflect on the learning opportunities from this case. So I entirely agree with that. I've expressed the same opinion. I think they did, as Chris Green has stated, the wrong thing for the right reason, essentially. And this final paragraph we've heard before, but I'll certainly read it out again and reflect on the kind of inferences and important information that is contained within it. It is my opinion that as a result of conducting this investigation, I believe that the elements of the events leading to the suspension of Lucy Letby, which were mediated by Stephen Breary and Ravi Jairam, warrant further investigation, possibly under the Trust disciplinary policy and or under the Trust bullying and harassment policy. The fact that Lucy Letby has been subjected to the ordeal of the last 4 to 5 months based on a gut feeling and the subsequent behaviour of Stephen Breary is not compatible with the Trust's values and behaviours. So this is a very damning conclusion that is made in this grievance procedure, and it is something that should have been actioned, in my opinion. I mean, Chris Green is saying here that it should be actioned, but on the basis of what is written here, there is no way that Stephen Breary and Ravi Jairam should have been allowed to dictate what happened on the unit. And also, as I say, there should have been a hardball response to this, and this could have been used as ammunition in that hardball response, essentially. Another thing to say, finally, I've commented on this previously, but Breary and Jairam have stated that they were being bullied on the unit and they were being treated unfairly by the executive team, whereas this grievance looks at the whole situation and then concludes the complete opposite, concludes that they were the ones who should be investigated for bullying, and that frankly should have occurred. So what have we learned from the second half of this document? The first thing is that this grievance document should have been released much earlier by the Thirlwall Inquiry. There was indeed no obvious reason to withhold it because there's nothing sensitive in this document, there's nothing that's been redacted, and of course it's been available for a decade. The external review was framed around Lucy's presence on the unit and the deaths and collapses. The proper next step, if any further action were to be taken, would have been an independent medical review rather than the police referral that actually occurred. The concerns about Lucy were driven mainly by consultant Stephen Breary and Ravi Jairam, and their case rested on gut feeling and commonality rather than any evidence. This is indeed made crystal clear by this document. There was no evidence to support any formal allegations against Lucy beyond the claim that she was on duty more often than others when incidents occurred, and even this association was described by Dr. Chris Green as tenuous. Nursing and executive staff generally had a positive view of Lucy's competence and professionalism, and many expected she would return to the neonatal unit once the reviews were complete. This included her nursing managers. The Trust handled the grievance slowly, but the delay was understandable perhaps because they wanted to deal with what was obviously a very serious issue thoroughly and fairly rather than rush to judgment. I think they did a pretty reasonable job of this overall. I personally reject the idea of a romantic relationship between Lucy and Stephen Breary. There's no evidence for this theory, it was only explored to understand why Breary singled her out. The Trust Board's decision to redeploy Lucy was made in what I would describe as an impossible situation, and Chris Green described it this way as well. They were trying to protect patient safety, avoid escalation and manage the risk of police involvement. However, they should have communicated more openly with Lucy. Lucy should have been allowed back to the neonatal unit quickly, and her return should have been managed alongside final mortality reviews. If this had happened, there's a distinct possibility it never would have become a criminal matter or a police matter. The behaviour of the consultants finally warranted further investigation under bullying, harassment or disciplinary policies, according to the conclusion of Dr. Chris Green. So finally, I'm going to summarise what we've learned from this grievance document as a whole. As we know, when the grievance process began, there was no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Lucy wanted to return to the neonatal unit, and understandably, she wanted an apology and a full explanation. And from her point of view, this was also about restoring the reputation she had built as what was already a highly regarded neonatal nurse. While there had initially been talk of reviewing the competence of all neonatal staff, Lucy became the central focus of this process. It is not in doubt that inappropriate comments were made about her by several people working on the unit. Lucy was moved off nights, then off the unit altogether and redeployed into PALS and patient safety while reviews were still ongoing. For Lucy, this must have been humiliating, and it would have been hard not to see it as a judgment on her competence. She was also not properly told, at least initially, why this was occurring. Later, the Trust made it clear that the consultants had raised concerns, but by then the damage had been done. In trying to protect her, the Trust appears to have limited what was said and may even have given false and incomplete explanations for her redeployment. In doing so, they left her isolated, confused, and badly misinformed. Whatever the sensitivities were at the time, that lack of openness was a serious failure and must have had a huge impact on Lucy's psychological well-being. The grievance process itself acknowledged that the Trust had not been fully transparent with Lucy, especially about the allegations and about how the process was being handled. And throughout all of this, there was still no hard evidence, only coincidence and association. The Trust may have believed he was acting for the right reasons, but the handling of supervision, redeployment and communication was seriously flawed. We also learned that rumours were circulating around the unit, including suggestions about Dr. Stephen Breary and Lucy having some sort of relationship beyond the professional. I reject that theory as there's no evidence for it, but it does give some indication of the degree of gossiping and speculation that was taking place, in the process making things harder for Lucy. Looking at the position Lucy was in, it becomes easier to understand why she reacted as she did, as why she was willing to go back on a unit where I believe her position was untenable due to the behaviour of others on that unit. She had been removed from the job she loved, her competence had been questioned, rumours were spreading, serious allegations were being made, she'd been cut off from colleagues and friends, she had not been given transparency about what was happening or why, she'd been told all staff would be treated the same, and that was untrue, she was promised a return that never came, and all of this was happening without any clear evidence against her. Against that background, it's firstly easy to understand why she was not in the best frame of mind when she wrote the infamous green post-it note, and secondly, why she wanted to resurrect her professional reputation. The police interview with Dr. Chris Green is also revealing because it shows how late the grievance material appears to have been considered in Operation Hummingbird. The interview is dated the 2nd of October 2019, after Lucy had already been arrested twice. The grievance was clearly not viewed by Cheshire Police as a significant part of the constabulary's investigation because Green was not even interviewed until very late in the process. And when asked about Tony Millea, Lucy's union representative, it was indicated that the police had not even heard his name before. This essentially confirms that Cheshire Police did not meaningfully investigate the circumstances at the Council of Chester. By this time, they had already explicitly accused Lucy Letby of murder in her 2019 interviews, and they were only now, 30 months into the investigation, speaking with the doctor who chaired the grievance procedure and hadn't even encountered the name of the union representative who had written to the Council of Chester on the 2nd of September 2016 to warn that Lucy could seek constructive dismissal. While we're on the topic of oversights, the grievance document should have been released earlier by the Thirlwall Inquiry because there is no obvious reason to keep it back or treat it as particularly sensitive. It has been available for 10 years, there could be no excuse for it taking so long to release. Concerns about Lucy were driven mainly by consultants, particularly Breary and J-Ram. Their account says that their case relied on gut feeling, commonality, and nothing else at all. There was no evidence beyond the fact that the nurse who worked hard and was entrusted with sicker babies was present more often than others when incidents occurred. Nursing and executive staff viewed Lucy as competent and professional and anticipate that she would return to the unit once the reviews were finished. The external review was really framed around Lucy Letby's presence on the unit and the deaths and collapses, but if anything further had to be done, the proper next step should have been an independent medical review, not the police referral that ultimately occurred. The Trust was certainly in a precarious position, trying to protect patient safety, avoid escalation and manage the risk of police involvement. But even if its motives were understandable, the way it handled the situation was still deeply flawed. They mishandled communication with Lucy and allowed the consultants too much leeway. Dr. Chris Green conducted the investigation and concluded that a disciplinary investigation would have been justified. I see no reason to disagree with this. Finally, I just wanted to give an update on a few things related to YouTube. I haven't done this for quite a while, but my subscribers have steadily increased to close to 7,500. And you can see in the second image here that the channel's gone over 1.5 million views now. And by the time this is released, we will have gone over 400,000 watch hours as well. So I wanted to say a quick thank you for the support, because I never would have thought I got anywhere near these numbers. I mean, I first started posting on this channel in April of last year, and I first started posting regularly just a year ago, and I never would have thought I'd get anywhere near what I have, and it's really very much appreciated. While I'm on the topic of support, I just want to mention as well that my book is coming up on the 9th of July. Thursday the 9th of July is the release date. Again, if I could ask for your support for that, it's something that I've invested a lot of effort into, with the hope of educating people and drawing more attention to what I believe to be this egregious miscarriage of justice. When this goes out, this video, I'll be on the verge of beginning to record the audiobook. So we're all on target for the audiobook to come out on the same day as the paperback, the hardback, and the ebook. So if obviously you could buy the book and review the book online, then it would be very much appreciated. With that being said, I hope you've enjoyed this investigation and analysis of this new grievance document. If you have any comments, queries, etc., please do let me know, and I'll look forward to reading them.